Samuel chapter 25, which has a lot of nuances to it. There's some sad things that happen, some challenging things that happen, some good news for David. So we're going to try to go through it fairly quickly. There's a lot of it. But to start with, chapter 25, verse 1, we lose Samuel. So now Samuel died, and all Israel assembled and mourned for him, and they buried him at his home in Ramah. Then David moved down into the desert of Paran. One verse on the passing of Samuel is not enough, right? This man was so important to Israel for so long, and then when we finally get to him passing, it's just, and then Samuel died, and the people got together and mourned him, and we move on with the storyline. There's not much there. Now, we're not through with Samuel. Samuel is going to make a cameo appearance a little bit later on in the Scriptures, but we'll save that for when we get there. There's a couple of things that I think we should not assume when we read that verse. It says, all of Israel assembled. I don't think that all of Israel means Saul. Saul and Samuel had not spoken in a very long time. And the last time that Samuel had spoken to Saul, it was a very caustic thing. God's will against Saul and how he was going to lose the kingdom and all those things. So I don't assume that all of Israel means Saul. I also don't assume that all of Israel means David. David's on the lam. He's got 600 men with him. They're hiding out in different places, moving from location to location. I don't think David's going to show up for the funeral. I know that David loved Samuel, and in his own way, Saul may have loved Samuel. But there's some politics going on here that make me believe that maybe neither one of those men were actually at the funeral. They may have both been there. I have no way of knowing. Scripture doesn't tell us, but that's just my assumption. Some things that Samuel was responsible for in Israel. First of all, he was the last of the era of the judges. And as we went through the book of Judges, we saw some of those guys that were really great. And we saw some of them that were just horrible. As a result of that, when you get to the end of the line, you'd really like to end strong. And they do. Samuel is one of the best of all of the judges. And different than a lot of the judges, Samuel was not called on to lead the people physically as much as he was spiritually. He wasn't a great warrior. He didn't put together an army and go beat the Midianites. Samuel was more a man of spiritual pursuits, even though he would go and make sacrifices and encourage and be the go-between for Saul in his pursuits. But by and large, Samuel was not the kind of judge that, say, Samson, right in front of him, had been. He was God's man from his youth all the way to the time of his death. He was one guy in Scripture that you can look at. You just can't find much wrong with Samuel. King David, he'll have his problems. King Saul, definitely his problems. But the guy who anointed both men, he's a pretty good guy. Samuel is really a stellar individual in the Old Testament. All right, well, let's read from verse 2 down to verse 11 and get introduced to a guy named Nabal. A certain man in Maon who had property there at Carmel. Carmel is the mountain. It's over toward the northwest corner of Israel, over toward the Mediterranean Sea. Elijah fought the prophets of Baal at Mount Carmel. He had some land near Carmel, and he was very wealthy. He had 1,000 goats, 3,000 sheep, and he was shearing them at Carmel. His name was Nabal, and his wife's name was Abigail. She was an intelligent and beautiful woman, but her husband was surly and mean in his dealings. He was a Calebite. In other words, he was the descendant of Caleb, as in Joshua and Caleb. So Caleb, a good reputation, good man, one of the two that believed that they could take the land in the first place, but this descendant of his was not so much. While David was in the wilderness, he heard that Nabal was shearing sheep. So he sent 10 young men and said to them, "Go up to Nabal at Carmel and greet him in my name." Hang on to that. Greet him in my name. Say to him, "Long life to you, good health to you and to your household, and good health to all that is yours. Now I hear that it's sheep shearing time. When your shepherds were here with us, we did not mistreat them. The whole time they were at Carmel, nothing of theirs was missing. Ask your own servants, and they will tell you. Therefore, be favorable toward my men, since we come at a festive time. Please give your servants and your son David whatever you can find for them." This was a normal custom. People knew that there was a big feast going on. Can you share? Would you like to give us a little bit of what you've got? David's men arrived, and they gave Nabal the message in David's name, and they waited. Nabal answered David's servants, "Who is this David? Who is this son of Jesse? Many servants are breaking away from their masters these days. Why should I take my bread and my water and the meat that I have slaughtered for my shearers and give it to men coming in from who knows where?" Sweet guy, right? So the introduction that we have, that Abigail is a really sweet woman, but she's married to a really surly man, holds up. Nabal is not a nice guy, and he's not about to share. What we find out, even from the mouths of Nabal's men, is that David's guys, while they were in the area, nobody would mess with Nabal's men, because David had 600 soldiers, or 600 guys, living out there in that region, and they weren't going to start anything because David was known to come to the rescue for people. So they left Nabal's people alone. So Nabal now has a great harvest, if you will. He's got lots and lots of animals, and he's got lots and lots of wool and fleece, and life is good. And David says, "What about it? You know, we took good care of your people. Will you take care of us?" And Nabal says, "I don't know who you are, and I don't care. And if you're running from Saul, then I just as soon have nothing to do with you." Now we find out later, in fact from his wife, that Nabal's name means fool or idiot. There you go. Her understanding of who her husband is that he lives up to his name. Why else would you say something like that to David? Now, what does David's name mean? Anybody know? David means beloved. He is the beloved one. And Abigail's name means a father's joy, right? So we've got beloved and a father's joy and the idiot. That's what we've got going on out there in the wilderness. The real problem is that Nabal is just a hard man to get along with. But I wonder why Nabal wouldn't share with David. There's a couple of possibilities I came up with. You may come up with another one. Everybody but Nabal seems to hold David in high regards, like the kind of guy you'd want to be on your side if you have a problem. Did he fear Saul? It hasn't been that long since Saul went down to the priests at Nob, killed them all, right? So David had an association with them. Saul killed all of them. Maybe he knows about that. Maybe Nabal is just trying to hedge his bets a little bit. Saul's got more soldiers. He's the king of Israel. I don't want to mess with him, so I'll take my chances with David. Or possibility number two, maybe he's just greedy. Maybe he just doesn't want to give up any of the stuff that he thinks is his. Did you notice the verbiage? Why should I take my bread and my water and the meat that I have slaughtered for my shearers and give it to men coming from who knows where? I me mine, I me mine, I me mine. Right? This is my stuff, and I'm not about to share with you. Now, it was customary in those places in those days to share when you could. Nabal certainly had the ability, but he didn't have the desire. Go to verse 28. Nabal's wife, being intelligent as she was, knew that bad things were about to happen. When David's men got back to him and reported what had happened, David took an oath before the Lord. And he said, God do so to me, and even worse, if not every man in that camp is dead by morning. So David and his soldiers are on their way to Nabal's shearing place. What would you call it? The place of shearing. He was on his way to where Nabal was shearing his sheep. And he had every intention of just wiping out the whole clan. He had been insulted, right? Remember, go to him in my name. So when he got the answer that he got, it wasn't just, we don't want to help you guys. It was, we don't like David. We hate David. Who is this David? So David's about to go show him. Well, while he's on his way, Nabal's wife comes up with a good response. Look at verse 28. Please forgive your servant's presumption. The Lord your God will certainly make a lasting dynasty for my Lord, because you fight the Lord's battles. No wrongdoing will be found in you as long as you live. So the kind of praise that Nabal should have given, go tell your master this. And here, take these gifts to David and tell him that I know that his dynasty is going to be established and that he's a great man. None of that from Nabal. But Abigail says the right things. Now, starting in verse 29, it's almost like a poem, at least the way it's translated in the NIV. Even though someone is pursuing you to take your life, the life of my Lord will be bound securely in the bundle of the living by the Lord your God. But the lives of your enemies he will hurl away as from the pocket of a sling. Isn't that a beautiful thing to say? Abigail's got it. She's a good spokesperson for the family as opposed to her idiot husband. And so she tells David these things, and she has brought him all kinds of wonderful gifts from the shearing floor. All the things that should have been sent by Nabal, she brings with her. My favorite part of that, by the way, you will be bundled up, right? You will be given a place in the middle of the living, bundled up, held securely among the living, whereas your enemies will be thrown away from the pocket of a sling, right? Just cast out. Beautiful, beautiful thing to say, right? As you go on down through the discussion, David says to Abigail in 32, praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, who has sent you today to meet me. May you be blessed for your good judgment and for keeping me from bloodshed this day and from avenging myself with my own hands. Otherwise, as surely as the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, who has kept me from harming you, if you had not come quickly to meet me, not one male belonging to Nabal would have been alive by daybreak. So he tells her where she was headed. She goes back home and wants to tell Nabal what she's done. He has no idea that she has taken it upon herself to give these presents to David and his men. When she gets home, Nabal has been to a party. He's thrown a party because they're through taking the sheep, and he's drunk. So she comes in to tell him, and she can't really deliver the news that night because he's too drunk. So she waits, and in the morning, she tells him the things that have happened. Start down in verse 36. When Abigail went to Nabal, he was in the house holding a banquet like that of a king. He was in high spirits and very drunk. So she told him nothing at all until daybreak. But in the morning, when Nabal was sober, his wife told him all these things. His heart failed him, and he became like a stone. About 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal, and he died. So David doesn't kill Nabal, but God does. I wonder, when it says he became like a stone, you almost wonder if he didn't just have a stroke right there. She tells him David was on his way with a force that was going to overthrow you, kill all of your men, and take your stuff by force. And I stopped him. Nabal, like a stone. 10 days later, he's dead. When David heard that Nabal was dead, he said, "Praise be to the Lord, who has upheld my cause against Nabal for treating me with contempt. He has kept his servant from doing wrong, and has brought Nabal's wrongdoing down on his own head." Then David sent word to Abigail, asking her to become his wife. His servants went to Carmel and said to Abigail, "David has sent us to you to take you to become his wife." She bowed down with her face to the ground and said, "I'm your servant. I'm ready to serve you and wash the feet of your Lord's servants." Abigail quickly got on a donkey and, attended by her 5 female servants, went with David's messengers and became his wife. David had also married Ahinoam of Jezreel, and they both were his wives. But Saul had given his daughter Michal, David's wife, to Paltiel, son of Laish, who was from Gallim. So, like I said, a real mixed bag here. We start out with Samuel dying and all of Israel mourning Samuel, and then we find out about this fool who stands up to David. He eventually dies, and David ends up with all the stuff, right? When he dies and David marries Abigail, who gets the stuff, right? So now David's got access to all this stuff, and he's got another wife. His wives don't play as big a role in his life, perhaps, as do the wives of Solomon, his son, who has 700 of them. Does anybody know how many wives David ended up with? He had 8 of them. 8 wives. Okay? And I went and looked up a source that has them listed, and I'll just read them off to you. And you tell me which one's missing. Ahinoam of Jezreel, right? We just met her. He had married her in the meantime. Abigail from Carmel, we just met her. Maachah, the daughter of King Talmai of Geshur, we haven't met her yet. Haggith, Abital, Eglah, and Bathshua, who we know as Bathsheba, right? So there's 7. Who's not on the list? Michal, right? Michal is not on the list because that list is taken from 1 Chronicles 3. 1 Chronicles 3 is a list of David's children. Michal was barren till the day she died. We'll find out later why that might have been, but these 7 women all married David, all had children for David. The one that becomes the king after David was born to Bathsheba, right? That's Solomon. But all of these women were married to David. So I wanted to take just a minute or two to get myself in deep water and talk about multiple marriages among the kings of Israel. We don't know a whole lot about Saul. There's not a lot of discussion about all of his wives. But David has 8 wives. One of them, Michal, was his wife and then was not his wife and then was his wife again. Right? She was wife number 1 and then evidently became wife number 3 later on, or could have been 4 if we count her the first time. But anyway, he had all these wives bundled up. I want you to, and I want you to play along with me and give me at least 2 things that were good about multiple marriages. If a man had more than one wife, 2 things that were good about it.
Got lots of children, though.
Do what?
Got lots of children.
More children, exactly. They were a very agrarian society, so if a man had more children, he had more people to work in his vineyards, in his fields with his animals. Think back to Job. Job was a very righteous man. How many children did he have? He had 10 children, right? 1 wife, as far as we know, right? So he had plenty of kids, just 1 wife. But the idea of multiple wives means more kids. That's a possibility. What else?
Maybe more property.
Maybe more property. For Solomon, when he marries all the different daughters of kings in the area, he does a lot of that for political reasons. He marries their daughters or their sisters or whatever to kind of solidify contracts with all these different nations round and about. Okay, so that's 2 good things. Give me 2 bad things. What's a bad thing about having more than 1 wife? Jealousy, absolutely going to be a problem. Absolutely. We can just look back to Jacob, right? Jacob's 2 wives. They're sisters, but they're at each other the whole time, right? Lots of jealousy. One more. What's bad about multiple marriages? We don't see it in God's plan. It seems to be something that mankind came up with and God tolerated rather than something that God put in place. We don't know of Adam and Eve and Betty and Sally and Linda. You know, we don't have a list. We've got just Adam and Eve as the first couple. There is always going to be a pressure, a love of one more than the others. And so in the Old Testament, in the Old Law, God gave rules for if you have more than one spouse. Things that men must do if they're going to have more than one wife. So under the Old Law, they could do that, but they had to follow certain rules. And one of those rules was to give equal time. Right? You couldn't just live with this wife all the time and go visit that one now and then whenever you wanted to. That was one of the problems Jacob had with Leah and Rachel. That, you know, equal time, show equal affection, give them equal opportunity to have children was one of the things that was important. David probably loved Michal the most, if I've got it straight. He really loved Michal, but he lusted more after Bathsheba. So how do you have Michal in the house and Bathsheba in, it would be a tremendous difficulty for any man to have those kind of relationships. But David did have 8, and we'll meet all of them, as we go along. If you just have to pick one that's really smart and makes really good decisions, Abigail's not bad. She would be the kind of woman that after you met her and saw what she had to offer, that David asking her to come and be his wife makes sense, at least under their system at the time. Anything you'd like to add? Any questions? No? Okay. If anybody has a need you'd like to let us know about as we stand and sing.